Hey there, survivors. Thanks for tuning in to tonight's episode. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. It really helps me keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now let's get started. I had picked up my load early in the morning. The weather report mentioned possible storms in the afternoon, but I wasn't too concerned. I left the depot under slightly overcast skies, heading east toward a major city. The plan was to arrive by evening, unload, then park at a nearby truck stop. My schedule looked straightforward enough, and the radio chatter was uneventful for most of the morning. Several hours into the drive, the emergency alert system broadcast cut into my music. A piercing tone replaced my favorite station. At first, I assumed it was a standard weather advisory. Those were common enough. But the message that followed was unlike anything I had ever heard. The voice on the broadcast referred to a contagious condition that was disrupting public order. Authorities recommended everyone remain indoors, avoid contact with individuals displaying unusual aggression, and stay tuned for further updates. My first reaction was confusion. I even turned the dial to another channel, hoping I could continue listening to something more pleasant. But every station carried variations of the same emergency notice. The official tone made it clear this was not a prank or a local matter. They emphasized extreme caution and informed listeners that major roads were experiencing closures. I decided to remain calm and focus on the next few miles. My best guess was that I should continue toward my destination, but keep an eye out for any official detour or sign. Traffic grew thicker as I approached a large overpass system. This route was well known for bottlenecks, but that day, the line of vehicles extended farther than usual. Brake lights flickered like a string of scattered dots. Trucks, family sedans, and SUVs were stuck in place. For a while we crept forward inch by inch. Soon, we came to a dead stop. My rig was halted in the center lane, jammed between a minivan and a compact car. Horns honked in frustration, but nobody could move. I checked the CB radio to see if other drivers had updates. The channel was full of people speaking in anxious tones about road closures. One voice warned that authorities were shutting down interchanges. Another person insisted we get off the main highway and find smaller roads. Yet we were trapped in a sea of unmoving vehicles, so there wasn't much of an option. We had formed a line of steel and glass that stretched out of sight. The sky was turning a deeper grey, threatening rain. While waiting, I took a moment to survey the road ahead. The overpass loomed about half a mile forward. From my elevated seat, I could see the top of the traffic jam. Cars were at a standstill, forming multiple rows that converged as the lanes merged. Another voice crackled over the CB. "They're telling us to avoid large gatherings. This highway is one huge crowd." The sense of tension in those words was undeniable. I switched back to the local FM band, and the emergency alert system voice returned. The speaker reiterated that the condition was spreading, instructing listeners to stay put if they couldn't reach a secure location. That suggestion struck me as contradictory, since we were already stuck in a vulnerable position. If there was a real threat outside, we were practically sitting in a congested target. Eventually, drivers began opening their doors. The temperature was rising, and many had shut off engines to conserve fuel. People walked between cars, some just stretching their legs. Others wandered around, looking for any sign of progress. I remained in my cab, scanning the horizon. Far beyond the overpass, I noticed a faint commotion. At first, it looked like individuals running in panic, but the distance and angle made it tough to see clearly. I couldn't tell what caused their fear. The next moment, an unsettling wave of panic seemed to ripple through the line of stalled cars. Shouts echoed across the lanes. A distant crash rang out. I leaned forward on my steering wheel, trying to see what was happening. A few people in the distance started scrambling back to their vehicles. Doors were slammed, engines revved. Some drivers tried to push their cars onto the shoulder, but there was no space to maneuver, and the traffic jam was too dense. I grabbed my CB microphone. "Anyone got eyes on what's happening up there?" I asked. A shaky voice responded, "They're going crazy. I don't know what's going on. They look not right." More static came through. Then someone else chimed in with a calmer explanation. "We've got people running from a group on foot. They appear injured or ill, but they're acting violent. Keep your doors locked." Hearing the word violent made me focus on my own safety. I checked that my doors were locked, my windows were up, and I took a moment to think about the possibilities. We had been warned about unusual aggression. Could this be connected? Every fiber of my being told me that staying inside was the best, immediate choice. If there was some kind of outbreak, mingling with a panicked crowd would not help. Moments later, the severity of the situation became painfully clear. A car door near the front swung open, and the driver sprinted away, weaving through the gridlocked lanes. People started yelling for help. Some tried to reverse, but the jam was too tight for any vehicle to move more than a few feet. Horns blared non-stop. I saw shadows moving between the lines of cars. The sun had slipped behind the clouds, creating an unsettling gloom. Figures stumbled forward, weaving erratically. One of them collided with the side of a sedan, then bounced off, as if not concerned about the impact. Nearby drivers tried to leave their cars, but more figures emerged, blocking their paths. Their motions weren't coordinated, but they were persistent. From the driver's seat, I could only see partial glimpses. People falling, doors flung open, individuals climbing onto hoods in desperate attempts to escape. The entire highway transformed into a chaotic scene. I gripped the steering wheel, trying to decide what to do. The minivan in front of me had kids in the back seat, and I noticed the driver scrambling to keep them calm. The look on that parent's face was nothing short of distress. Suddenly, a man sprinted from the left lane and pounded on my truck's passenger door, pleading for help. He was drenched in sweat, his face drawn with stress. I hesitated for a moment before reaching over to unlock it. He managed to climb inside, breathing heavily. "Thank you," he whispered. "They're attacking everyone outside. I don't know what's going on, but they're not listening to reason." I glanced around the cab, ensuring I had enough space to help him. The man introduced himself, but in that chaotic moment, I barely caught his name. He tried to explain that the ones causing panic were showing signs of severe infection. He had seen them advance on others, oblivious to any attempt to calm them. He asked if we could drive off the highway shoulder. I had to remind him that we were blocked by a guardrail and rows of vehicles. Even if I rammed the guardrail, there was another lane of traffic stuck on the other side. The man muttered something about climbing out somehow, but I didn't see a feasible path. We were essentially in a metal cage formed by cars and concrete barriers. The next few minutes were a blur of frantic radio calls. Someone shouted that the authorities were on the overpass. Others said law enforcement had arrived. I peered over the dash, looking for flashing lights, but saw none. The only visible signs of authority were distant emergency vehicles on some parallel road, sirens faintly echoing in the distance. It seemed the entire region was overwhelmed. As the crisis deepened, a wave of people tried to flee on foot. They squeezed between cars, sometimes running across hoods to bypass the tight rows of vehicles. The man next to me stared out the window, clearly unsure of his next step. We both watched in silence as the crowd attempted to push back against a group of infected individuals. Some people had improvised barricades using traffic cones or even torn pieces of metal from the side rails. However, it didn't take long for those to be broken through. The realization set in that this was more than just a local event. The EAS had warned about an aggressive disease spreading quickly, and this was likely one of its hot zones. I tried the CB again to see if any drivers closer to the front had better news. A woman's voice came through, her words shaking with concern. "They're coming from all angles up here. We can't move forward because there's a mass of abandoned cars. If you can back up, do it." I looked behind me, but the line of traffic extended as far as I could see. Between my trailer and the vehicle behind me, there was almost no space. In this environment, reversing could cause a collision or wedge the truck sideways. I asked the passenger if he wanted to try heading backward on foot. He seemed torn about leaving the safety of the cab. but he also knew being boxed in was not ideal. While we considered our options, an alarming sight appeared. Several individuals, clearly infected, were forcing themselves onto the minivan in front of us. The driver tried to ward them off through the gap in the window, but to no avail. I noticed other drivers stepping out with objects in hand, but it was too late to prevent the chaos. The reality of our predicament hit me with full force. We were in a standstill, surrounded by people who had lost control, and we had nowhere to go. The man in my passenger seat trembled as he watched. He looked at me and said, "We need to get out of here." His voice had a tone of resolve that was both desperate and firm. I checked the side mirror, scanning the shoulder and the guardrail. There was a small break between the concrete barriers about 50 yards behind us, possibly for emergency vehicles or maintenance crews. If we could somehow reverse enough to reach it, I might angle the truck through that opening. But it would require space that we didn't have. I asked if he would be willing to direct me, maybe guide the drivers behind me to move out of the way. He nodded, though he seemed reluctant to step back outside. After taking a moment to steady himself, he opened the passenger door. I watched him climb down carefully, trying to stay low. Once on the pavement, he approached the car behind us and started waving. I could see him speaking, though the horns and shouting drowned out everything. The driver behind me began to reverse, creating a few feet of space. Then I noticed another person in the next lane doing the same. For a moment, it seemed as though a coordinated retreat might be possible. Several vehicles in that section tried to align themselves in a way that would let my rig maneuver backward. I inched the truck into reverse, checking both side mirrors repeatedly. The entire process was complicated, but seeing people band together for a moment gave me a sense of cautious optimism. That small hope was quickly overshadowed by new movement. A larger group of infected individuals came rushing from the front of the traffic jam. They advanced in a disorganized surge, colliding with cars, scraping against side mirrors, and knocking on windows. More panic ensued. Drivers who were trying to help now had to protect themselves. My passenger, seeing this wave, changed direction. Instead of guiding me, he was forced to dodge people who were attempting to grab at anything in their path. I heard screams. The occupant of the minivan up ahead managed to open the driver's door and slip out, only to face a crowd rushing in from the opposite side. That person then retreated behind another car, looking for safety. I tried not to lose focus. If we had any chance, it was through that maintenance break behind us. Every second counted. Suddenly, the man who had joined me in the truck was back at my passenger door, pounding on it to be let in again. The infected group was closing in. I unlocked the door and he climbed in, breathless and pale. "They're coming from everywhere," he said in a near whisper. "No one can stop them." I pressed down on the accelerator slightly, trying to reverse. The truck inched backward a few feet, but movement was slow. The crowd of cars had limited space. Meanwhile, the overpass was filling with even more frantic people. It was as if we were at the center of a growing storm. Moments later, I saw a section of the guardrail shake. Another truck driver, apparently seeing the same maintenance path, was attempting a similar maneuver from the lane on the left side. The area became a jumbled mess of vehicles. My CB crackled with calls for help, and the radio continued to blare EAS updates stating that first responders were doing everything they could. They advised everyone to remain calm and avoid contact with those displaying abnormal aggression. It sounded hollow in that moment, given the scene right outside my windshield. The infected individuals advanced further, moving between stopped cars. Some people managed to run away down the shoulder or slip through gaps. Others weren't so fortunate. The pounding of fists on doors echoed across the highway. One by one, drivers who thought they might wait out the jam in their seats were forced to realize waiting was no longer an option. I felt cornered in my cab. The large windshield provided a view of the chaos, but it also made me feel exposed. The man beside me kept watch on the passenger side. We noticed a couple of individuals pressing their faces against random car windows, apparently searching for ways inside. Their expressions showed no recognition of normal social boundaries. I set the truck in neutral for a moment, trying to gather my thoughts. My mind raced through possible actions. If we stayed still, there was a risk that the infected would eventually swarm around the truck. If we left the cab, we'd be on foot in the middle of a highway jam. That could be even more dangerous. The only path I saw was to keep inching backward toward that maintenance break, hoping to reach the ramp that might lead to a back road or an exit. However, the odds were not in our favor. Through the side mirror, I saw that some of the drivers behind us had already abandoned their cars. A woman was running down the shoulder with a small bag slung over her shoulder, casting anxious glances behind her. Others attempted to follow, though some were intercepted by infected individuals who appeared from behind clusters of cars. At this point, a distant rumble of thunder echoed overhead. Rain threatened to fall. The wind picked up, tossing debris across the interstate. Loose paper, plastic bottles, and other trash swirled around in small gusts. The stormy gloom added to the unsettling atmosphere. I decided to move the rig in short increments whenever I saw an opening. Even half a foot at a time felt like progress. The man in the passenger seat got on the CB, urging other drivers to clear a path if they could. A few responded with supportive words, but many had their own problems to handle, and the frequency was chaotic. Shouts, static, and overlapping voices made communication nearly impossible. As we backed up a little more, a loud thud hit the side of my trailer. I glanced in the mirror and saw someone stumble away, apparently disoriented. I couldn't tell if they were infected or just panicked, but it was clear they wanted off that highway at any cost. I paused, checking to make sure I hadn't actually collided with them. They seemed to scramble away without serious injury, so I eased backward again. Finally, we reached the maintenance break. It was a narrow gap in the concrete barrier, wide enough for a small vehicle but challenging for a full-sized truck. I angled the front of my rig slightly. The trailer would have to scrape the edges if we tried to pass through. The question was whether it would even fit. My passenger looked at me, then back at the gap. "We have to try," he said, acknowledging that the alternative was to remain stuck. I prepared to maneuver the truck carefully, turning the wheel and shifting into the lowest gear. Metal screeched against concrete as the trailer's corner made contact with the barrier. Sparks flickered near the back wheels. I had to pause again to realign. All the while, the crowd of infected continued pushing toward the cluster of vehicles. Through the windshield, I saw that many people had either fled or been confronted by those aggressive individuals. We heard repeated thumping on nearby cars. Windows cracked under pressure. Some folks tried to drive over the median, but that risked getting stuck. The entire scene had turned into an urgent scramble for any path to freedom. I pressed the accelerator and felt another jolt as the trailer caught on a protruding section of concrete. The truck groaned under the strain. My passenger looked ready to leap out if we got stuck. I slowly turned the wheel a bit more, and at last the trailer popped free of the barrier's edge, swinging wide behind us. We were now angled toward a service lane that ran parallel to the highway. In the distance, it led down a gentle slope into an older side road. I had no idea where that road ended, but it was away from the chaos on the overpass. We weren't fully clear yet. I had to navigate around a few parked maintenance vehicles and some scattered cones. Luckily, no one occupied that service lane, which allowed me to roll forward at a cautious speed. I glanced to the right and could see the gridlocked highway receding behind us. It felt like we were leaving a storm, but the sense of relief was dampened by the reality that we were far from safe. The man in my passenger seat gazed back at the jam. I could see his reflection in the side mirror. He looked stunned. His voice was low as he said, "How did everything fall apart so quickly?" I had no answer. We hadn't heard a clear explanation about why people were so aggressive, other than the government broadcasts about an infectious condition. All we knew was that the highways had become a place of danger. We followed the service lane past a chain-link fence, weaving around orange construction barriers. Eventually, the lane curved underneath a smaller overpass. Water dripped from above, forming puddles on the asphalt. The tires splashed through them. My mind lingered on the fact that many people were still stuck on the main highway. I tried not to imagine what would happen when the infected group reached them in greater numbers. After a few minutes, the service lane merged into a deserted road that cut through a neglected industrial park. We passed warehouses with boarded windows, rusted fences, and signs that had faded from years of neglect. It felt surreal to be in relative calm after the chaos on the highway. No infected individuals roamed these streets, at least not that we could see. I slowed the truck, trying to determine the next step. My passenger suggested we find a secure location to gather information. One warehouse had a gravel lot that seemed big enough for me to pull over. With caution, I parked the rig near the building's edge. I left the engine running while we assessed the perimeter. The structure looked abandoned. No lights, broken windows, graffiti on the walls. It wasn't inviting, but it offered a break from the panic we had just escaped. Before stepping out, we tuned the radio to see if there were more EAS bulletins. The same recorded message played, advising people to stay home if possible, avoid major highways, and contact local authorities if they witnessed unusual behavior. That last part felt ironic, considering we had just seen a large-scale event. We tried the CB again. Some voices were calmer in this area, likely because the immediate chaos was behind us. A few other truckers mentioned they had managed to exit the highway in different locations, equally rattled by what they had encountered. The man riding with me suggested we should keep moving before any roaming groups found their way onto these side roads. He had a point. Still, I wanted to gather my bearings. I recalled seeing a smaller highway on the map a few miles south of this industrial zone. If we could navigate these back roads, maybe we could bypass the overpass entirely and link up with a safer route. Deciding to press on, I steered us out of the lot. The narrow streets were mostly free of traffic. We spotted a few parked cars, but no people. Rain began to fall, tapping gently on the windshield. The gloominess of the weather matched our unsettled state of mind. My passenger said little. I think we were both trying to process the shock of what we witnessed. As we made our way through the empty streets, another EAS announcement interrupted the station. The speaker warned of additional restrictions, urging drivers to avoid traveling unless absolutely necessary. We exchanged a glance. For us, it was necessary. Being out here, at least we had options to find a route that wasn't overrun. We eventually came across a small convenience store with lights still on. The open sign flickered, and a few scattered cars sat in the lot. It felt both risky and vital to stop. We needed fuel, and perhaps more information. I pulled the truck around to the side, leaving the engine idling. The store's windows were covered in posters advertising sales, so it was hard to see inside. We took a moment to decide if one of us should go in, or if we both should remain in the cab. Ultimately, we agreed that I would stay with the truck while he checked for supplies and any news from locals. He stepped out cautiously. The rain fell harder now, creating a steady patter. I watched him enter the store. The minutes ticked by, and every second of waiting felt stretched. I half expected to see infected individuals rounding the corner. My grip stayed firm on the wheel, scanning the area for any movement. Thankfully, nothing stirred. After what seemed like a long while, the passenger emerged from the store, carrying a small bag. The expression on his face was a mix of relief and concern. He climbed back into the cab and mentioned that the store clerk was in a state of alarm, but had shared a little more information. Nearby towns were also experiencing disturbances. Some roads were blocked. Officials were urging people to remain isolated if possible. We agreed that we couldn't continue blindly. We needed a plan. The passenger said there was a rural highway about 4 miles south that might lead to a safer region. It was less traveled and might still be open. That became our new objective. We set off again, navigating through back roads. The map on my phone loaded slowly, but I managed to get a general sense of direction. The further south we went, the fewer signs of life we saw. The storm made the sky darker, adding to a sense of uneasy calm. Eventually, We reached that rural highway. No gridlock here, just occasional patches of farmland and rows of trees. We saw only a couple of other vehicles, both driving away in a hurry, presumably also seeking a safer route. The radio repeated the same official warnings, with no sign of improvement. We had escaped the overpass, but we both wondered how long we could keep moving before encountering another blockade or group of infected individuals. The memory of that stalled highway still lingered. I could picture the lines of cars, the frantic shouts, and the aggressive movements of infected people swarming around helpless bystanders. It was a reminder that everything had changed in an instant. The open road, once a place of comfort, had become an avenue of danger. We carried on for several more miles until we saw a small sign for a rest area. It might have been nothing more than a parking lot with a few vending machines, but it looked quiet. We pulled in to reassess. A single sedan was parked near the bathrooms, engine off. Nobody was visible. I turned off the ignition to save fuel, and we listened to the sound of rain against the metal roof of the cab. In that lull, we shared a few words about next steps. The man who had sought refuge in my truck revealed he had family out of state. He hoped to reach them if the roads allowed. I mentioned that I just wanted to stay safe and perhaps find a secure location until authorities contained the crisis, if that was even possible. The EAS messages indicated no immediate solution, only caution. We understood that an official rescue might not arrive anytime soon. We decided to rest for a short while, keeping watch in shifts. Though rest was difficult to find, we needed to maintain our energy. The tension had drained us. Every noise outside caused us to glance at the windows, expecting to see movement. Each flash of lightning illuminated the area, revealing nothing but wet pavement and a few scattered trees. Time passed slowly. Whenever an EAS advisory cut in, we listened carefully. None offered a reassuring update. Officials repeated the same guidelines: limit travel, avoid contact, remain indoors if possible. We exchanged a few quiet observations, remarking that the highways were undoubtedly a trap at this point, especially large ones near city centers. Our best bet lay in these lesser-used roads. At one point, I stepped outside to check on the trailer. I kept the passenger side door locked while he stayed in the driver's seat. The air was muggy, and the rain had slowed to a drizzle. I noticed some of the cargo had shifted slightly during our abrupt maneuvers, but nothing had broken loose. The silence in that rest area was unnerving, especially given the events we had witnessed just hours earlier. It was hard to reconcile this calm location with the chaos still unfolding not far away. I climbed back into the cab. We agreed to keep driving until we found a better spot to hole up. Perhaps a rural truck stop or a small motel off the main roads. At least there, we might have a solid structure, restrooms, and access to some provisions. Though the storm had lightened, the darkness of night was taking over. Pulling out of the rest area, we continued along that rural highway. Headlights cut through the gloom. Our pace was steady, cautious. Every so often, we passed a driveway or a side road. Most were unlit and uninviting. We saw a few old farmhouses set back from the highway, but there was no sign of activity. Whether the occupants had left or were hiding, we couldn't tell. Around midnight, we spotted a lone gas station up ahead, bright lights shining under a large canopy. A single car was fueling. We decided to chance it and pull in, hoping to top off the tanks. The large overhead lights made the area feel exposed, yet it also gave a momentary sense of relief to be in a well-lit place. The rain started again, lightly tapping on the roof as we parked next to a diesel pump. I stepped down from the cab, glancing around to ensure there was no immediate threat. The passenger walked around the station's perimeter to see if anything looked suspicious. The station appeared to have a small convenience store attached, though no one was visible through the windows. The single car at the pump left as soon as it was done, heading back onto the highway. We managed to fuel up without incident. The store was locked for the night, a sign taped to the door saying they had closed early due to the state of emergency. Empty shelves were visible through the glass, indicating that people had already cleared out most of the supplies. We didn't linger. After topping off, we continued onward, feeling marginally better knowing we had enough fuel to travel for many more miles. Continuing on, I reflected on the earlier events. The lines of cars on that highway, the distress of families trapped in vehicles, the unstoppable surge of infected individuals. It felt almost unreal, like a scenario one might see in a dramatic film. Yet this was happening, and the broadcast updates implied it was widespread. One question weighed heavily. How could we ensure our own safety long-term if the problem continued to spread? The man next to me stared quietly ahead, occasionally giving directions to keep us on the less traveled roads. We drove through the night, making short stops to verify we were on track. The darkness was complete aside from our headlights and the brief flash of lightning. The further we got from the city, the more remote and silent the landscape became. At dawn, we found ourselves approaching a modest truck stop. The building sat beside a rural intersection. A few other rigs were parked there, probably drivers with the same idea as us. We pulled in slowly, scanning the lot for any sign of trouble. Nobody appeared outside. The main lights inside the building were still on, indicating that either the power grid in this area was holding or they had a generator running. I parked in a space near the exit, ready to leave if a quick escape became necessary. We saw a few other weary-looking drivers stepping out of their cabs. They seemed on edge but not panicked, as if they too had experienced a version of what we went through and were just trying to collect themselves. The passenger and I had a short discussion about how best to proceed. We decided to cautiously approach the truck stop building to see if it was open and if the staff had any updates. The place was functioning, but with a skeleton crew. A single employee at the cash register confirmed they knew of the emergency. They also mentioned that they had limited food stock left. Most of it had been purchased by folks passing through, many of whom spoke of blocked highways and chaotic encounters. We grabbed a few snacks and some water bottles, then returned to the truck. Outside, a handful of other drivers stood in small groups, exchanging stories. One driver claimed to have seen entire towns shutting down. Another had come from the opposite direction of the city and described extensive traffic blocks and large gatherings of infected individuals. There was a shared sense of worry. Everyone spoke in low tones, wary of attracting unwanted attention. We didn't linger longer than necessary. Though it was tempting to rest there, a cluster of trucks and drivers could draw trouble if a roaming group arrived. We had enough resources to keep going for now. The passenger mentioned that if we continued another 20 miles, there was a chance we would reach a crossroads leading to more isolated towns. We decided that sounded safer than turning back or heading toward major highways. As we left the truck stop, I tried one last time to pick up an EAS broadcast. It was the same loop, repeating instructions for people to remain where they were, avoid contact with infected individuals, and wait for further assistance. The official nature of the announcements was at odds with the disorder on the ground. I didn't doubt that some agencies were trying their best, but it was clear this situation was beyond normal procedures. While we drove, the sun rose, revealing rolling hills and scattered farms. The sense of distance from the highway crisis was comforting. Yet, in the back of my mind, I knew that what happened at the overpass could happen anywhere if more infected people arrived. The question wasn't if, but when. Eventually, we saw a sign for a small town a few miles away. It had a population of only a couple thousand, according to the sign. Perhaps we could find an out-of-the-way spot there, or at least gather more local information. The passenger and I agreed that this was the next move. We turned onto a side road, grateful that the trip had been quiet so far. As the day wore on, I reflected on the memory of gridlock at the overpass. The screams, the attempts to reverse, the desperate cries for help. An interstate that was once a steady route for commercial transportation had become an impassable barrier, filled with people trapped in their vehicles. The sight of that minivan being surrounded haunted me. The cold truth was that in that moment, everyone was left to fend for themselves. In the midst of these thoughts, I glanced over at my passenger, who stared out the window at the rural road ahead. We had both come a long way in a short time. The timeline of normal life seemed to have collapsed overnight, replaced by a single-minded need for survival. We pressed on, carrying that memory with us as a warning of what could happen at any time if we encountered another congested area. It was a silent reminder to keep moving, stay alert, and never again allow ourselves to get stuck in a place where escape was impossible. The open road, once my greatest comfort, now carried an undercurrent of tension. No matter how far we traveled, the events of that day would remain in our minds, shaping every decision. And so, with the truck rumbling along a lonely rural route and the radio softly replaying the same official bulletins, we continued our journey into an uncertain future. The phrase, "Stay tuned for further updates," repeated on the broadcast, but we both knew that no broadcast could erase what we had experienced on that overpass. We could only hope that somehow, in the miles ahead, we might find a safer place to ride out the storm. That's all for now. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more unsettling creepypastas. Your support keeps my channel alive. Until next time, stay quiet, stay vigilant, and trust nothing, not even the silence.